if you were evaluating studies and data to include in your analysis, what types of questions you ought to be asking. So if you were looking at a study for direct climate impacts, you really needed to be looking at which direct climate impacts were addressed and which ones were omitted and what was the quality of the estimate. So for example, if you typically go to an insurance study, what you will find is that that insurance study looked at impacts to owned assets. What it doesn't look at is loss of individual income because your job is no longer existing or it's temporarily suspended. It might have looked at business interruption costs for your employer, but it does not look at lost tax revenues for the locality. So the issue of impact analysis is very important in terms of unwinding the value of economic studies. And you can go through each of these. You need to look and determine whether there's a representation of cross-sectoral interactions. And again, if there's a domino effect or a cascading impact, what is that? As a third item, it's critical to understand the time dimension, or particularly what financial analysts call tenor, meaning the term of exposure that you have. So in insurance studies, tenor is typically looking at 1 to 3 year terms, and so the price signal or premium that's sent only looks at 1 to 3 years. Even though climatic impacts may have cycles that are better reflected in a 10-year cycle. So it's very important to understand that if you were to extrapolate at some point in a 1 to 3 year cycle, it might or might not represent the mean or the median, or might represent the lowest point or the highest point in a cycle, because the time dimension isn't considered, it doesn't consider the natural cycle. It's also really important to understand that the focus, for example, if you're looking at time dimension in an insurance exposure analysis, again is quite short. But if you're looking at a municipal bond finance, it might be a 30-year term. And so the kinds of considerations that you need to have are quite different. They might have a demographic dimension in addition to having an atmospheric dimension, as well as a wide variety of other things. Growth is clearly important in terms of understanding growth impacts and prospects. Space. So how spatially sensitive is your study? So historically, regional studies or global studies for physical science you couldn't get satellite data that was any finer than perhaps 170 kilometers, 200 kilometers. But more recent data points are generally available down to 2 centimeters, depending on who owns satellites and what type of Earth observation data you can get. The difference is substantial in terms of the granularity of the possible economic impact analysis. And in fact, 2 feet, plus or minus 2 feet, can make the difference between being underwater and being above water, even 2 centimeters, laterally or vertically. So these are important things to keep in mind. Cross-border spillovers, are there things that are happening between countries that are going to impact this analysis? Where are your uncertainties, and are those uncertainties compounding, or are they averaging? What type of extreme weather is accounted for, and what vulnerabilities and adaptations are adjusted for in that process. So these are, from an academic perspective, probably the most cutting-edge considerations in terms of a qualitative set of assessment criteria for environmental modeling.